What happens when one of Hollywood's most legendary filmmakers sits down with one of daytime television's most outspoken hosts? You're about to find out. And trust me, this is not your typical morning talk show interview. Before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about what's about to unfold. Now let's get right into it. The studio lights were blazing as George Lucas settled into the chair on The View's iconic set. The audience applauded warmly, but there was an unusual tension in the air that even the casual viewer could sense. Joy Behar sat at the table with that familiar smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. The kind that suggested she had something cooking. "George Lucas, welcome to The View," Joy began, her voice dripping with a peculiar mix of sweetness and something sharper underneath. "Creator of Star Wars, one of the biggest franchises in cinematic history. Must feel good to have built something so massive." "Thank you for having me," George replied, adjusting in his seat. His tone was measured, cautious even. "It's been quite a journey." "A journey?" Joy repeated, leaning forward slightly. "That's one way to put it. Another way might be to call it a cash cow that you milked and then sold off to the highest bidder." The audience gasped softly. The other hosts exchanged glances. George's expression remained calm, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. "I sold Lucasfilm to Disney because I believed they could take the stories further than I could at that point in my life," George said carefully. "It wasn't about money." Joy let out a short laugh. "Not about money. You walked away with over $4 billion. That's a lot of not caring about money." "The majority of that went to charity," George countered, his voice gaining a slight edge. "Education initiatives specifically. But I'm sure you knew that before you made that comment." "Oh, I knew," Joy said, waving her hand dismissively. "But let's talk about what really matters here. You created this massive universe, right? This thing that people have loved for decades, and then you handed it over to a corporation that turned it into, well, let's just say the reception has been mixed." "The reception to anything is always mixed," George said. "When I made the prequels, people said, I ruined their childhoods. Now those same people defend them online. Art is subjective." Joy wasn't backing down. "But here's what I don't get, George. You had all this control, all this vision, and you gave it away. And now you complain about what they did with it. You can't have it both ways." "I've never publicly complained," George said, his voice firm. "Now, I've given interviews where I've been honest about my feelings, but I've never campaigned against what Disney has done. There's a difference between having an opinion and complaining." "The semantics," Joy shot back. "You told one interviewer that they didn't use your treatments for the sequel trilogy. That sounds like complaining to me." George shifted in his chair, stating, "A fact isn't complaining. They asked if my ideas were used. I answered honestly. Should I have lied? Maybe you should have kept your mouth shut," Joy said, and the studio went dead silent. The other hosts looked uncomfortable. Whoopi Goldberg opened her mouth as if to interject, but George spoke first. "Excuse me?" His tone was ice-cold now. "I'm saying," Joy continued, clearly committed to her path, "that you made your choice. You sold your baby. You don't get to backseat drive after you've handed over the keys." "I'm not backseat driving anything," George said, his voice rising slightly. "I was asked questions in interviews, and I answered them. Since when is honesty considered inappropriate? Since you cashed a $4 billion check?" Joy snapped. "You want to talk about honesty? Let's be honest. You're bitter that they didn't make the movies you would have made. You're bitter that the torch was passed and someone else is running with it." George's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Joy pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man who wants to have his cake and eat it too. You want the money, the freedom, the retirement, but you also want everyone to know that if you had done it, it would have been better." "That's not what I want at all," George said firmly. "What I want is for people to stop putting words in my mouth and twisting every interview I give into some narrative that fits whatever story you want to tell." Joy leaned back with a satisfied smile. There it is. The real George Lucas. Not the humble filmmaker, but the guy who's angry that his empire doesn't belong to him anymore. "My empire." George's voice was sharp now. It was never about empire. It was about storytelling. It was about creating something that meant something to people. And yes, I have feelings about what happened after I sold it. I'm human, but that doesn't mean I'm sitting around bitter and angry like you're suggesting. Then what are you doing? Joy challenged. Because every time you open your mouth about Star Wars, it sure sounds like regret to me. George stared at her for a long moment, and the tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a lightsaber. What I'm doing, he said slowly, is trying to have honest conversations about my life's work, but apparently that's too much to ask. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but George wasn't finished. You want to know what's really going on here? George continued, his voice steady, but filled with an intensity that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. You've decided before I even sat down what kind of interview this was going to be. You had your narrative prepared, your little sound bites ready, and nothing I say is going to change that. Joy's eyes flashed. Oh, please don't act like you're some victim here. You're George Lucas. You have more money and power than most people will ever see in their lifetimes. And that means I'm not allowed to have opinions. That means I'm not allowed to feel things. George shot back. Because last I checked, selling a company doesn't mean you sell your soul along with it. No one said anything about your soul, but you did sell your rights to control the narrative. That's what a sale means, George. You don't get to control it anymore. I'm not trying to control anything. George's voice rose, and for the first time, real anger flashed across his face. I'm simply living my life and answering questions when people ask them. If that bothers you so much, maybe the problem isn't with me. Sunny host tried to intervene. Maybe we should take a step back here. And no, Joy cut her off, her eyes locked on George. I want to finish this because I think what we're seeing here is exactly what I was talking about. You can't handle criticism. You can't handle the fact that someone is calling you out on your contradictions. George let out a bitter laugh. Contradictions. You want to talk about contradictions? You sit here every day on national television giving your opinions on everything under the sun. But when I give mine, suddenly I'm out of line. How does that work exactly? Because I'm a talk show host, Joy said flatly. That's literally my job. And I'm a filmmaker who spent 40 years building something from nothing, George countered. I think that earns me the right to have feelings about it. Having feelings is one thing, Joy said, her voice dripping with condescension. But what you're doing is Monday morning quarterbacking. You made your decision. Live with it. I am living with it, George said through gritted teeth. What I'm not living with is people like you telling me how I should feel about the most important creative work of my entire life. Joy leaned forward, her expression hardening. You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you're scared that history is going to remember Star Wars as something bigger than just George Lucas. That maybe, just maybe, other people can tell stories in your universe that resonate just as much as yours did. The audience murmured. Sarah N. looked visibly uncomfortable, but George didn't flinch. That's not fear, he said quietly, and somehow his lowered voice was more powerful than shouting. That's actually what I always wanted. I wanted Star Wars to outlive me. I wanted it to be something that could continue beyond my lifetime. But wanting that and having the process be painless are two different things. So, you admit it bothers you. You admit that you're upset about what they've done. Of course it bothers me sometimes, George said, his voice raw. Now, do you have any idea what it's like to create something from your imagination, to pour decades of your life into it, and then watch other people take it in directions you never envisioned? It's complicated. It's messy. But that doesn't mean I regret the decision. It sure sounds like regret to me, Joy said smugly. Then you're not listening, George fired back. Regret would mean I wish I hadn't done it. I don't believe I made the right choice. But making the right choice doesn't mean it doesn't come with difficult emotions. Why is that so hard for you to understand? Because you're trying to have it both ways. Joy's voice rose to match his. You want credit for being the visionary creator, but you also want sympathy for giving it up. Pick a lane, George. I don't want sympathy, George said, his face flushed. Now, I never asked for sympathy. What I want is to be treated like a human being who can have complex feelings about a complex situation. But apparently that's too nuanced for this conversation. Oh, here we go, Joy said, rolling her eyes dramatically. The old you just don't understand routine. Trust me, George, I understand perfectly. I understand that you're a billionaire who sold his toys and now wants to complain about how the new kids are playing with them. George stood up abruptly, and the audience gasped. You know what? I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Sit down, Joy said sharply. We're not done. Yes, we are, George said, his voice deadly calm now. I came here thinking this was going to be an actual conversation. Instead, it's an ambush. You had your mind made up about me before I walked through that door. I had my mind made up based on your own words, Joy countered, also rising from her seat. Don't blame me because you don't like hearing the truth. The truth. George let out a harsh laugh. You wouldn't know the truth if it hit you in the face. You've spent this entire interview putting words in my mouth and then attacking me for saying them. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. It's just mean. The other hosts were frozen. Whoopi finally found her voice. George, maybe we should all just take a breath and no, George said, shaking his head. I'm done taking breaths. I'm done trying to explain myself to someone who has no interest in understanding. You want to paint me as some bitter old man. Go ahead, but you're wrong. And deep down, I think you know you're wrong. Joy's face was red now. I know I'm right. And you storming off is just proving my point. What point? George demanded. That I won't sit here and be insulted. That I have enough self-respect to walk away from a hostile conversation. If that proves your point, then your point is meaningless. My point is that you can't handle criticism. My point is that for all your talk about being a storyteller and an artist, you're really just another Hollywood ego who can't stand being challenged. George stared at her for a long, tense moment. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. You want to talk about egos? George said, his voice quiet but cutting like a blade. Let's talk about someone who makes a living tearing people down on national television and calls it commentary. Let's talk about someone who asks guests onto a show just to attack them and then acts surprised when they defend themselves. Joy's eyes widened. Excuse me, I ask tough questions. That's what journalists do. Journalists pursue truth, George said. You're pursuing ratings. There's a difference. The audience was completely silent now. Every eye locked on the confrontation. Alyssa Farah Griffin looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. How dare you, Joyce said, her voice shaking slightly. I have been doing this for decades. I have interviewed presidents, world leaders, celebrities, and I have never had someone speak to me this way. Maybe you should have, George said simply. Maybe. If someone had called you out years ago, this conversation would have gone differently. Joy's mouth opened and closed. For perhaps the first time in View history, she seemed genuinely speechless. George took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was calmer, but no less intense. You want to know what really bothers me, Joy? It's not that you disagree with me. It's not even that you're challenging me. It's that you're not actually interested in having a conversation. You're interested in winning. And that's sad because we could have talked about something meaningful today. Oh, we're talking about something meaningful. Joy found her voice again. We're talking about accountability. We're talking about a man who wants to control his legacy without putting in the work anymore. I put in 40 years of work, George said, his voice rising again. 40 years I changed cinema. I changed technology. I built companies from the ground up. And yes, I sold them. That was my choice to make. But don't you dare tell me I don't get to have feelings about it afterward. Your feelings aren't the problem. Your hypocrisy is you sell something and then criticize the people who bought it. That's hypocrisy, George. I never criticized them, George insisted, his frustration evident. I stated facts. I gave honest answers to questions. If you can't tell the difference between criticism and honesty, that says more about you than it does about me. There you go again, Joyce said, shaking her head, twisting everything around. Making yourself the victim. I'm not making myself anything, George said, his voice weary now. I'm just trying to exist in a world where apparently giving honest interviews makes you a target. Whoopi Goldberg finally managed to interject with authority. Okay, I think we need to pause here. This is getting out of hand. It got out of hand the moment I sat down, George said, looking at Whoopi. And I think everyone here knows it. Joy wasn't done. You know what, George? You can leave if you want. Walk off the set. Prove my point even more. Show everyone that you can't handle a real conversation. George turned to look at her, and his expression was almost pitying. Joy, this isn't a real conversation. This is theater, and I'm not interested in being part of your show anymore. Then go, Joy said, crossing her arms. But don't expect anyone to feel sorry for you. I don't, George said quietly. I never did. That's something you projected onto me because it fit your narrative. All I ever wanted was to be heard. But you can't hear someone when you're too busy talking over them. He turned toward the edge of the set. And for a moment, it looked like he was actually going to leave. The producers were scrambling. The audience was on the edge of their seats. And the other hosts looked absolutely mortified. But then George stopped and turned back around. You know what? He said, looking directly at Joy. I'm going to stay, not because you want me to, but because walking away would let you win. And you don't get to win today. Not like this. He sat back down in his chair. And the shock on Joy's face was priceless. I'm going to sit here, George continued, his voice steady and controlled. And I'm going to finish this interview like a professional. And you can ask me whatever questions you want, but I'm not going to let you bully me. I'm not going to let you twist my words. And I'm certainly not going to let you make me into whatever villain you need for your show today. Joy blinked, clearly thrown off her game. I am not trying to make you into a villain. Yes, you are, George said calmly. But here's what you don't understand. I don't need your approval. I don't need your validation. I've made my peace with my decisions. Have you made peace with yours? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Joy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Sarah N., sensing an opportunity, jumped in quickly. George, let's talk about your current projects. What are you working on now? George turned to her gratefully, and a small smile crossed his face. Thank you for asking. I've actually been focusing on experimental film making and supporting young filmmakers through various education initiatives. That sounds wonderful, Sarah said, her relief palpable. Tell us more about that. As George began to speak about his current work, Joy sat back in her chair, her arms still crossed, her face unreadable. The rest of the interview proceeded awkwardly with the other hosts desperately trying to steer the conversation into safer waters, while Joy remained mostly silent, occasionally shooting glares at George. When the segment finally ended and they cut to commercial, George stood, shook hands with the other hosts, and walked off the set without acknowledging Joy. The audience broke into uncertain applause, unsure of what they had just witnessed. As the studio lights dimmed, and the crew began resetting for the next segment, one thing was abundantly clear. This was an interview that no one would forget anytime soon. George Lucas had come to The View expecting a conversation. Instead, he got a battle, and whether he won or lost was something viewers would be debating for years to come. So, what do you think? Was George justified in standing his ground, or did Joy have a point about accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I want to hear from you. Who do you think won this clash?